You keep saying you got something for me. Something we call love, but confess. You've been looking where you shouldn't have been looking. Now someone else is getting all your best. These boots are made for walking. That's just what they'll do. One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you. You keep saying when you ought to be changing. And you keep thinking that you'll never get burned. But I just bought me a brand new box of matches. What I know, you ain't had time to learn. These boots are made for walking. And that's just what they'll do. One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over. Are you ready, boots? Start walking. Hi, folks. Today we are talking about chapters 3 and 4 of Sam Gindin and Leo Panich's Making of Global Capitalism. For once, I said it correctly. Making of, not rise of. It's not the goddamn Star Wars universe. It would be funny if it was called, like, The Making of the Jedi instead of, or The Making of the Skywalkers instead of Rise of Skywalkers. So this is a chapter where, after having in the first two chapters laid out the way that the American state capacity to intervene in a global economy was built during the 19th century, and then crucially, the period between World War I and World War II. And after World War I, the U.S. Had an incredibly important and influential, and you could argue preeminent position in the global economy. Like, that is World War I. After World War I is when America becomes a global creditor and not a debtor for the first time. But the capacity, which existed to create a domestic capitalism by that point, did not exist to really impose a U.S.-led international settlement on the world. Instead, you had a British-led, global trade network that was still based on spheres of imperial influence. And when you know it, the crisis of the Great Depression comes along, the big collapse happens, and all of those tenuous networks of international cooperation snap. Everyone turns inward. They go to war again, inevitably, as well. It has to happen, because in those kind of crises, you have unsustainable internal pressures that have to be reckoned with. You can either have a revolution or you can have a war. One or the other. No opting out of it when you have that level of crisis in conditions that capitalism will not cannot assimilate. And at the end of that war, who's the last man standing? The U.S. of A, baby. And so now we get a situation where a U.S. state that has grown massively in its internal capacity, its ability to regulate, its ability to manage economic structures, because of this explosion in bureaucracy and not just like in the public sector, but like the management revolution among capitalist enterprises means you have this. And also, something that's not spoken of too much about this period is that during the massive wartime capital accumulations that are occurring, what do you know it? You have a huge technological boom, too. So there's this second industrial revolution in chemical, transportation, and communication technology that happens in the 30s to the 40s that then also allows for state capacity to be magnified. And therefore, now we have a situation finally, after one more giant global war that nearly kills everybody, we finally have a situation where the United States has sufficient internal domestic political capacity, bureaucratic capacity, and currency, and a currency that can manage a global capitalist economy. And we have a situation where the U.S. state has to take point here, because even though it is in the best interest of capitalism in general for Europe to be rebuilt and for free trade, or some regime of like a relatively unrestricted trade to be enforced, there are still elements within capitalism who are threatened by what that would mean and who resist it. And whereas the formal state after World War I wasn't strong enough to really push through that, this formal state that exists now has by far sufficient capacity to overcome those unorganized individual like interest groupings and point them towards a new horizon of global capitalism. So the model for this new global capitalism is, of course, going to be the American New Deal regulatory state, because that's who's going to be imposing it. Who else would they fucking get any ideas from? They just did this in America. Now they're going to export it to the world. And that means we're going to have capitalism, but it's going to be capitalism that is checked by regulatory agencies and a general redistributive political economy, where the laboring classes will, having lost their political power, like their ability to like assert, control over conditions of manufacture, which they were threatening to, grasp there during World War II, that's gone. But what will be left is this mechanism where they can make demands of profit. They could say, we have a percentage of this profit. We are owed it. And the political structures that will be brought into being will allow for those demands to be taken into consideration by people at the heights of the political economy, which was not true before this point, and which is why you kept having this cycle of massive economic collapses and warfare. Now, the State Department, which you would think would have been riding herd on this, during the war, is basically not involved. It's the project of the Treasury Department, under the direction of the guy I talked about last time, Harry Dexter White, who was this blue blood New Dealer who helped shape the agreement to come, and who was, I guess it's not fully confirmed. There's still some people who don't buy the evidence, but he's widely considered to be and suspected to be an actual Soviet spy, which is very funny, of course. So it was the Treasury Department that quarterbacked the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is the structure that will facilitate the creation of a global capitalism after World War II. And what it's going to do is it's going to facilitate investment in European economies that will guarantee U.S. capital, building back up the destroyed nation states of Europe, but creating systems within them where fiscal discipline, this is the word that they always talk about, is always imposed from the central node of Washington, basically. Getting rid of the spheres of influence, getting a relatively equalized market with all rules imposed by the United States. And there are institutions that were built that were going to do this, like the World Bank and the IMF, which are going to guarantee private loans to European governments on conditions of like certain structural relationships within their economies, and more than anything, ensuring that capital controls, that is, a government's ability to stop people with capital, foreign investors and domestic ones, from moving their capital out of the country, which is what you do if you're a capitalist and you don't like what the government's doing. It is the final veto. I don't know how well this is understood, but the final veto for getting all of their control over an outsized influence over political outcomes. The final veto that concentrated capital has over government policy, discrete nation-state policy, is capital flight, leaving. And capital controls prevent that. And one of the reasons that Wall Street was tepid about Bretton Woods and actually had to sort of be corralled by the U.S. government on it was because they were afraid that these new institutions would allow for capital controls, would guarantee that would make it so that the money that went into Europe wouldn't be able to get back out again. And worst of all, that these governments might pursue full employment over price stability. Because those are the two things you can pursue as like a national, if you are going to take the handles of of an economy. Because what we're doing here with this new global capitalism is we're breaking the spell of the British imperial capitalist model. Like the gold standard British trade imperium that ruled in the 19th century and was undone by the world wars was premised on a religious, ideological, deeply embedded, transcendent belief in the inviolability of markets. Like you could have some sort of government policy overruling markets, but of course it would be malign inherently. There can be no virtuous intervention in the market. Of course, this is all fantasy. The state is making the market. The state is determining the conditions the market operates on. There is no separation. It is purely ideological. But who's going to tell these people that they're wrong? Who will they ever encounter that's going to say, actually, that's not true? Now, that becomes unsustainable after World War II. World War II proved the unsustainability of it. So now, this new... the new truce that capital is willing to have with this emboldened government, formal government structure, state structure, is to say, okay, fine. The government can intervene to set industrial policy. Now that that's settled, and we're willing we're willing to stipulate that, we can now assert that, okay, there is inevitable intervention. There can be good or bad intervention, because there's two things you can do with your overall like monetary policy, like the central bank authority that like regulates economic flows. You can orient it around full employment, or you can orient it around preventing inflation, price stability they call it. Because if you do have full employment, you're going to unless you expropriate, this is the thing, unless you expropriate from capital, you will have inflation. Now, of course, once again, well, why don't you expropriate from capital? The forces insisting upon that aren't on the stage. They're corralled in the Soviet Union, and they're hidden away in warrens. They're crypto. They might be there like as fellow travelers, but they cannot assert within the imperial core, they cannot assert an alternative to this because they've been defeated. But given the structure, if we're assuming capitalism cannot be violated, if we're assuming that the class structure of the societies and then the greater global class structure of capitalists and workers broadly, capital and labor, if you assume that difference, that distinction, and you assume that capital, that profits of production must flow to capital, then full employment will bring inflation, which is why they were able to create in this era a new theology where the cardinal virtue of a central banker or a regulator is to keep inflation low. Now, of course, again, they could have used this new machinery to create full employment. But the problem with that, the reason that inevitably leads not to inflation, but to the expropriation of capitalism, is that you can't just have an economy. If your government is imposing full employment, right, as its mandate, the question immediately becomes, employed doing what? And what that requires, answering that question requires, is a social project. Now, the problem with the Soviet Union is they never got to that level because because the World Revolution never happened and the tides went back and Russia was the only redoubt. the answer to that question in Russia was always prevent being extinguished by the West, compete on capitalism's terms to win in the world contest a battle against capitalism. Which is why it's no coincidence that at the same time they're creating a productivist consumer economy, in the West, Khrushchev is transitioning Soviet policy around consumption in the East. But here we have at the creation, the Secretary of State under Truman, Dean Acheson, called his memoirs of this period present at the creation. Everyone understood that this is the forging of a new reality here. So the idea of like using full employment to essentially euthanize the rentiers, which Keynes always imagined being the outcome of the reform road that he envisioned. But because the people who could actually veto all of these decisions made by the state, which are capitalists, not labor, are obviously existentially opposed to that possibility, they impose a logic of price stability on these new regulatory structures. And the thing that's going to do it is the U.S. dollar. That's what's going to stand in as like our international economic Eucharist. This thing that holds the mystery that we cannot actually speak of, that undergirds the theology of capitalism, which is always there, but which is by definition sublimated, because the fantasy of capitalism is that there is this desacralized market space that we operate in, but that just abstracts the sacred into capitalist trade itself. Because as I said, if you have full employment as a principle, then you have to answer the question: what are these people working on? What are they making? And that has to have a social answer. What capitalism does is it answers that question by pointing towards the void capitalism creates. The answer in capitalism is, okay, no full employment. We're going to watch about inflation, which guarantees the reserve army and unemployment and all that. So what's going to guide production then? And the answer is consumption. You're going to build stuff for people to buy. Well, what are people going to buy? They're going to buy the stuff that assuages the alienation of living under capitalism, the inherent alienation of living in a world where one works on behalf of another. One spends their time, their labor time on earth, their essence, at the behest of someone else. And that is spiritual arsenic. And the whole, the early 20th century was a battle about who was going to control these newly created technological regimes of economic production. And the answer is the capitalists. But that there's still tons of workers, and in Europe especially, they are very organized, a lot of the time, in the West even, with communist parties that saw their influence rise during the war because they were the only ones. They were the only ones who actually fought the fucking fascists. Everybody else just either collaborated or stood on the sidelines. And they're making demands on behalf of workers. Some demands are going to be vetoed by capital, but others are acceptable. And the big one that ends up defining the entire era is in exchange for essentially politically neutering the working class. It happened in the U.S. with the Second Red Scare. It happens in Europe, honestly, with like Gladio more than anything. In exchange for that, though, you can sublimate that lost autonomy of your life that the political struggle would have provided with the ability to consume, the ability to pursue purchases that will make your life, the time you do spend outside of work, your unalienated time, but it's still alienated because you're thinking about the time that you spend elsewhere, and you're dealing with the toll, the literal physical toll of having done that. But it makes that time disproportionately pleasurable. And this is that engine is what has fueled the economy ever since the creation of this global system. And it is in fundamental existential conflict with the biome, with the earth, with the ecological matrix that we are inherently embedded in. Now, technology is trying to win a race with nature, basically. That's what the Elon Musk wing of capital, the fantasy that we're all imbibing every day about how we're going to get out of this intractable conflict, is the idea that capitalism or that technology will just outpace and outrun nature. It's done it so far, but we'll see if that's going to keep happening. I think it's insane to depend on it, which is all we're left with capitalism. So there's this battle that is, or I guess it's a sublimated battle because the war just happened. Nobody really wants to fight anymore. So what they do instead is that they enter into this political negotiation that sees a treaty with the working class made in the U.S. and in Europe. And the difference in the structures that come out of that are reflected in the difference in the class composition and relative power of the competing class elements in these societies. So you want to know, why don't we have all the cool stuff Europe does? It's because in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the working classes of Europe were more organized, more radical, and more socially in solidarity than the American working class. Like they had, for example, dedicated socialist parties, which could coordinate their actions in electoral lines. All we had in the United States is the Democrats, which were never a socialist party, whose associations with the labor movement came long after the fact of the party's creation. I'm sorry, but the PMC is not what drives a wedge between the working classes, or at least it's not the only thing that does so. In the American context, the working class has always been fatally fractured by the reality of slavery and expropriation. There have been efforts, as always, a huge push to try to go against that tide with some effect, and sometimes effective, some not. But that's just not something that European working class politics had to deal with. It's playing it on easy mode, basically, compared to the U.S. And so everybody gets some sort of deal, all based on productivist consumer economies where we're making stuff. We're making big durable goods for people to buy. The people who make them are then going to be given enough money to be able to buy them. And we're going to trade among nations. And when we can offload surpluses and deal with the ever-present capitalist danger of overproduction through trade. And we can do a balance of trade that keeps relatively everybody happy, keeps capital flowing, keeps profit accumulating, and keeps some percentage of that capital flowing downward in the form of redistribution through high wages. So what's interesting, though, about the imposition of Bretton Woods, which is that it was resisted by a lot of U.S. capital because they were afraid of these mechanisms being used to pursue full employment. And there's still regular reactionary middle class voters who are like the center of gravity of one of the two political parties, who are just psychically hostile to any notion of foreign entanglements and don't have a familiarity with like the reality of global trade networks and finance and their necessity to keeping the capitalism that they depend on, the small business and small manufacturing capitalism that they depend on going. They don't know any of that. They fill in the gap of their ignorance with ideology, which is what we're doing all the time. Of course, our understanding and familiarity is ideologized too, but at a different level of abstraction. Here, because these people are fixed geographically in like the middle of the country for the most part, Robert Taft representing Ohio, they're building it, their ideologized understanding of these concepts on a completely sand basis, whereas Eastern capitalists who end up going to war with them over American politics in the next decades are at least dealing with like the necessary realities of building these institutions and keeping global capitalism going. And all these things, all these forces were arrayed the same way against the League of Nations. And then they were able to defeat it. The League of Nations failed to be ratified by the United States, and the United States never ended up joining it, even though it was Wilson's brainchild. Now, in contrast to that, the state capacity that has been built up and the technology that the state capacity can be utilized towards, like radio, for example, means that the U.S. state can put on an unprecedented propaganda effort on behalf of Bretton Woods. Magazines, newsreels, radio ads, speeches, tours. All you had with League of Nations was poor ass fucking Wilson going on a whistle-stop tour while dying of strokes. There was no radio for him to go on. He just had to go place to place while his brain vessels were exploding. Here you could force multiply that message throughout technology of mass media. And they were able to get Bretton Woods pushed through. And that is a dollar imperium administered by these new international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and this thing called the Committee on Economic Development, which was created in 1942 and which ended up sort of being the monastery or I guess like the theological seminary for the distribution of the creation of agents of a gospel of high productivity, high employment, but a baseline commitment to capitalism that is then imposed on the rest of Europe. Now, what that means, but to get that into Europe, what needs to happen is the United States economy has to be put on firm ground. And this is an important thing to remember. It's like all of this was based on the U.S.'s hugely powerful economic engine of this period. And the thing is, in the immediate post-war period, there was a real fear of another depression. Because, I mean, you had huge inflation right after the war. You had a huge strike wave as all of the unions that had agreed to a no-strike pledge during the war to help win the war all started insisting on making good all the things that had been promised them and then deferred. All those chickens came home to roost. 20% of the workforce was going to be reintegrated into it, because that's the percentage of workers were represented by the demobilized army of the United States after World War II, and that basis was made by the deal I talked about earlier: labor peace, cheap mortgages for white workers. High wages connected to productivity, and political castration in the form of the Second Red Scare. And that is what then becomes the engine of the post-war economy that spreads to Europe through Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan. So Bretton Woods comes down to creating a dollar imperium, right? Which is it's a war between our guy Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes, who wants to use this this trade currency called the Bancor, which you could argue is just a way to keep the pound sterling on the table. But that's defeated. We get dollar hegemony. But then you have this remaining problem of, well, how do you pump up these ravaged European economies? And that is the 1-2 punch of Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is direct U.S. money pumped into the European economy. In 1948 and 1949, Marshall Plan money represents 15% of the GDPs of the UK, Italy, and France. 25% of the GDP of West Germany. And all of this money is dependent upon, these economies that are being built back up, conforming to certain expectations of what a responsible, democratic, freedom-loving country is. And one of the big ways they do that is that there's all these new orgs, these new organizations, and these new central banking institutions and lending institutions that are now all going to be staffed. And they're all staffed, not coincidentally, by ideologues of that religion of inflation that I talked about, that sees inflation as sin because it sees worker power over the economy as sin. The same way 19th century gold capitalism imagined intervening in the market as sin, that is no longer viable. Now, intervening in the market on behalf of workers is the sin. Intervening into the economy, into the market on behalf of capital in the form of fighting inflation, imposing price stability, that is virtue. That is aligning oneself to the will of God. Now, of course, the funny thing is that the Soviets asked, hey, we'll get that Marshall Plan. And, of course, you could say, oh, that's being disingenuous because they would have wanted, to keep stampeding over Europe. But I really don't think that's true. I think the Soviet Union was willing to go to a much more radical place of cooperation after the war. But the thing about that is it would have undermined capital's control over dictating these conditions, shaping this post-war world. And they didn't want to, and they didn't have to let that happen because the fucking Soviets were exhausted. Couldn't keep the war going. They didn't even have a nuke yet. And so now all these bankers were going to determine what these new economies and these newly pulled back up, these newly affirmed states, what they can do. And of course, it's going to be on capitalism's terms, but with some formal mechanism for accommodating working class demands, but only in the direction of consumption. All right, so that brings us to Chapter 4, Launching Global Capitalism. So Bretton Woods, Marshall Plan, in the offices of the State and Treasury, they build these networks. They build this program, the software, and then they got to actually build the machine to run it, as in an actual economy in Europe that can fix into the U.S. trade network. Because the thing that's motivating all of this is the understanding at the highest levels of U.S. government policy that capitalism could not be sustained in the United States without capitalism being sustained in Western Europe. They understood that they were inextricably linked. Now, that right there, that understanding coming from, imperial work towards the goal of winning a war, where the amount of ideological mystification that you allow yourself has to be minimized, still exists, never goes away, but at a lower level of abstraction, or I'm sorry, a higher level of abstraction. That knowledge, that reality, that experience, I should say above anything else, that experience of winning the war, of building the state capable of winning the war, did not happen in the hinterland of America, where America's reactionary politics is going to emerge, and that now dominates the Republican Party. That was originally instantiated by Ohio Republican Senator Robert Taft, who said, fuck all this, fuck Bretton Woods, fuck the UN, fuck international cooperation, because we're going to keep American capitalism pure by keeping it away from dirty foreigners. They didn't have the experience to know that that wasn't true. What they had instead to fill in the gap of experience was the ideologized fantasy of what American capitalism is. That can only be sustained by them because they're living Main Street USA lives, where the violence of the system has been totally abstracted away from them and turned into labor relations. And so that is where the resistance to this whole thing is going to emerge and is eventually going to take over the Republican Party and now dominates it and does want to see the global system of capitalism overthrown because they have an ideologized fantasy that they can maintain it discreetly. Although I would argue at this point there are probably some like super rich Republicans, super rich guys like Thiel, like the billionaires who support the Republican project, who know that that won't work but don't care because they think that they have accumulated enough personal capital to sustain capitalism in like isolated, suspended, geographically fixed regions. The archipelago of capitalist dominance, the eternal like luxury oasis that they think that they've been building so steadily, and so they don't care. But everyone below them actually thinks that there is something called like American capitalism that can sustain all the good things that they associate with it without global flows, without the U.S. reserve currency. Can't be done. But they don't know that. So there's an interesting thing happens during this period where the U.S. is looking at this broken Europe, right? This Europe that has been completely shattered, and it has to be rebuilt to reconnect it to the U.S.-led international capitalist system, to circulate the goddamn fucking capital, which it has to do. It has to circulate, and it has to circulate at larger and larger intervals, more and more elliptical and extended orbits. That is its expansion. That is the heart of it. Capital must flow, and it has to flow over bigger and bigger circuits over time. And it has to start with Europe. Now, the U.S. could have imposed some sort of like post-national order on Europe and say, guess what? There are no, you little stupid Westphalian nation states, you guys, we can't trust you to fucking run your own shit because look what you've done. You're over. There's no, and of course, Stalin didn't even do that in Europe or in the Eastern Europe. They kept the nation states, but that's because they had the structure of the Soviet Union to sort of build on, like the periphery where you just get like more and more formal autonomy as you get farther away from the metropole. But the U.S. could have carved up Europe, but it decided no, these nation states have to be built back up because capitalism requires the state. Because at a fundamental level, there's no extracting the market from the state institutions that allow it to exist. And so for capitalism to exist in these nodes and then connect to the American supernode, they needed to be sustained by political and economic institutions that are national in character. Because that is what the reality of European life reproduced. Nationality was real. It had been instantiated in the 19th century and then had been ritually, violently reaffirmed by the world wars. So the state had to be rebuilt. And as I said, it was rebuilt on social democratic lines because of the power of the Western working class. You get a Labour government take power in UK right as the war ends. The first majority Labour government ever. They say this is honestly, the British suck obviously, and they're monsters. Like they're the people who birthed this demon into being. They're its most like sallow acolytes. They're the most hollowed amongst us. Give him credit for, instead of kissing fucking Churchill's ass for winning the war and letting him be, prime minister for life, they turfed him out immediately as soon as the war was over. And they said, yeah, blah, 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 let's have a national health service. And in France, now, but, that's the reactionary heart of England, where, like, the radical working class is very low, is a very low level of influence and power. Now, in France, for example, that was occupied by the Nazis and dominated by a Nazi puppet government, the only real political force that had any legitimacy popularly left were the communists, because they, instead of accommodating this one way or the other, had fucking gotten shot and shot Germans and persisted in resistance to fascism, which totally delegitimized the bourgeois parties and representatives. Similarly in Italy. So you have very powerful communist movements. Here, we get a higher level of like social investment than in other places. But here, specifically in France and Italy, in addition to just the organizational and influential advantage of capital, allied with the United States, like this state structure, this capitalist bourgeois state structure, is the one doling out Marshall Plan money, which is huge. We also had, the other hand, the left hand of this process. If the right hand is the formal regimes of economic power, the left hand, the sinister, the hidden hand, is military coercion. And at this moment, it is clandestine because, we're at the end of the cycle of conflict of World War I. It's going to rise up in a crescendo until you have the mass slaughter, the formal military mass slaughter of Vietnam. But it starts off with covert action. It starts off with allying with the Corsican mobsters who controlled the Marseille ports to break the communist-led strikes in the port, allying with the mafia in Italy to bribe and assassinate the Christian Democrats into a victory over the communists. Creating stay-behind networks of formal military and military formal. It's essentially an alliance. All the Gladio states are an alliance between formal regimes of coercion in the capitalist state structure, the military, and their equivalent in the shadow economy, the military of criminality, which is organized crime. Organization is what concentrates power. So organized crime and the military. And that combination helps prune the hedges of this left-wing alliance that, asserts power, asserts for control everywhere in Europe. And one interesting thing that I didn't really know and that they point out is that we think of the neoliberal formula as something that emerges in the 70s as a result of the crisis then. But Pandin point out that the birthplace of neoliberalism was Germany, West Germany after the war, which at the time it wasn't even neoliberalism. It was called ordo-liberalism. Very cool name. The early Christian Democrats who took power at the U.S. behest after the war had a much more market-oriented politics than the ones in the other former combatants of Europe. And the reason for that is because the left had been exterminated in West Germany by the Nazis. And then the United States was formally occupying it militarily. The same wasn't true in other countries. And so they got a more pure strain Keynesianism than West Germany did. But even in West Germany, you saw a welfare state emerge so that conflict does not explode. Because you have this ever-present danger of too much crisis in the center of these countries means you're back to the conditions of World War II. You're back to a thing where there has to be a revolution or there has to be a war. The social forces that could guide it towards a revolution or another war have been discredited by the disaster of World War II, leaving the only credible alternative, the forces internally in these societies that want to push for a goddamn revolution. And that is what the Marshall Plan did more than anything, was to prevent this revolution from happening. Because you had a situation in Europe after the war where capital is fleeing to the United States. Capital is getting the fuck out of Europe. And American private capital isn't bringing it back in. After the war, American foreign investment stayed in the Western Hemisphere, in the American sphere of influence, because it could. It was easy. It was the path of least resistance to Canada and to Latin America. Europe was way too risky for private money to go there. So you had this huge outflow of capital in these countries. That's a death spiral. The only way to get out of it is to either expropriate capital, which of course, not an option, or do even more harsh austerity, which is going to give you a revolution. Can't have it. Can't have it. I can't have them commiserating. I can't have do more austerity, make them stand in line longer for biscuits. I can't have it. Like these guys, they just fought a war, a lot of them. They're just coming home with their guns over their shoulders. They've seen death. That's the thing. That's why that was such a moment of possibility, is that you had these guys who'd been traumatized by the war, which is, that ends up in the interwar period benefiting mostly reactionary politics because the left was cucked. But by the end of the war, Second World War, you had like a bunch of leftists who were ready to fight, way more than had been before. But what made them make a deal instead of fight is because instead of that harshening austerity, Marshall Plan made it rain, prevented austerity, maintained levels of income and consumption. But that was all public money. And this is a thing that, and then they built up these states that have regulatory regimes that regulate capitalism, that guarantee redistribution of profits, all stuff that a capitalist in his narrowest interest doesn't want, but which were necessary for the continuation of capitalism, which is why you need that state capacity, which we have seen in America be dissolved by the post-70s world. Now we're in a situation where the inherently cannibalistic nature of capitalism that has essentially always is deferred through redistribution of surplus, no longer has the surplus. So all of those, the surplus redirected politically is the motor oil in the engine of capitalism. And the oil hasn't been changed since 1973, basically. So all of these fucking parts are just spraying sparks off of one another because the discrete interests of capital have to be short term. It's the state, which is just the capital like through a mirror. It's like the other lobe of the brain of capital. People who are capitalists and operate for capital's interests, but through the institutions of bureaucracy and politics rather than like ownership and management have a view of it that is more comprehensive and that can intervene to sustain its longevity. Can't do that anymore. Which is why the longevity is not being sustained. And so this is a process. This liberalization of Europe starts here. Like, we have a social democratic treaty signed in the late 40s between labor and capital in Western Europe on the conditions imposed by the Marshall Plan, by this dollar hegemony, which said, for example, that every dollar of Marshall Plan money that a government in these European countries would get, they had to commit to spending an equivalent amount of their domestic currency on projects that had to be approved by the United States, like that were within a American-approved rubric of policy options. That's how they were able to direct this flow. But they didn't direct it towards creating like mini Somalias, like free market utopias, like the psychos who took over Iraq did after the invasion there. Because they knew that that was not a way to create a stable state structure. People the psychos who took over the Iraqi government and the Iraqi political economy in the early aughts genuinely believe that the way you stabilize an economy is by unleashing entrepreneurship or whatever else, because they've been propagandized. They've been ideologically processed into believing that, so that they don't even know it's not in capitalism's interest to do that. It's not in the greater interest of the project of stabilizing Iraq as a node of American power projection in the Middle East, which is what we were trying to do there. And the very thing we did, trying to make it happen, undid it and made it impossible because of those ideological blinders. Which is why it's so funny that Rumsfeld is the guy responsible for like the most succinct expression of like the reality of ignorance in the functioning of our in all of our social institutions, science, government, policy, everything is the unknown known, or the unknown unknown. So they're creating these states that regulate capitalism in the interest of the combined class interest of American capitalism. Even though there are individual capitalists who are pissed about this, who don't want it to happen, who are trying to resist it. As I said, the same time this is happening, the Khrushchev, or I mean after Khrushchev, once this is like really, this process takes a hold in the 50s, and you see this really work. Like there's initially a terror that, oh God, what about these European economies? What if they can't grow at the rate that they need to keep redistributing, keep the capital flowing and keeping everybody relatively socially stable and comfortable? Trying to find this thing I wrote. What was it? Socialism. I wrote something on one of these. I can't find. Is this it? Oh, I did this very poorly. I'm sorry. I forgot where I wrote it, but I remember what it is. So the way they're able to do this, the way we're able to kickstart this thing, is not just putting in a bunch of money. It's by facilitating trade between European countries. So that instead of the U.S. just dumping a bunch of money into Europe and then them all just like distributing it and, consuming exports from the United States mostly, they're going to be domestically producing. And the way to do that is if they're trading with each other, is if they're taking that money and they're buying stuff from each other. And the way that they facilitate that is creating a clearinghouse where, even though this is a dollar economy and everything is priced in dollars at the end of the day, but the dollar is at this point scarce because all this capital is flowing to the U.S., and and there just aren't enough dollars, unless you want inflation, do you, to facilitate all of this European trade. There's a clearinghouse that allows these countries to trade with each other in each other's devalued currency, because there is a huge devaluation of European currencies that happens after the war, and the unpegging, the euthanization of the pound sterling, which had been the reserve currency before the war. And Keynes fought for it, fought for sterling. He told the Whitehall when he was trying to sell Bretton Woods to them that he fought for sterling. But at the end of the day, sterling was euthanized. But the British got a really good deal off it. They got, the same way the Dutch had earlier, they got to be bought out of their controlling share of global capitalism and then given a golden parachute. Like the British did that to the Dutch, and then the Americans did it to the British. And they were able to build their welfare state. They were able to build their NHS and their estate housing, and they were able to build this durable system on the back of a trade regime there. The U.S. basically gave them favored status. Like the U.S. was trying to get rid before the war of the British tariff regime that favored that was that gave preference, I should say, that gave preference to trade within the Commonwealth, within the empire. And they created, a more equitable trade relationship after the war. But during the austerity years, the early austerity years of Britain, the U.S. suspended that and sort of did voluntary trade restriction with England to help their domestic economy grow back up. And, we owed it to them because it's British systems of imperial and bureaucratic control that we then took to take over the world. Like the CIA was made by the Brits. They taught us the statecraft necessary to have a meaningful, deep state with a intelligence headquarters, which the U.S. didn't really have before World War II. And also, this economic structure created is the vision of the reformist minds of English political economy. The special relationship. I mean, think about it. The Glorious Revolution is essentially this merger between the Dutch and the English capitalist classes. One of those inverted deals where you switch headquarters, and that meant that the Dutch were no longer a colonial power, but they were able to maintain their dynamic trade economy in this European system that is now headquartered in Britain. If the Dutch had held on to North America, it would have probably gone the other way around. And probably on much more devastating conditions for the British because, the piddly little island. But Britannia rules the waves. So you have this new system where U.S. capital is flowing in to make up deficits, to provide things like oil and energy and food inputs, to allow capital elsewhere to go towards investment in the economy, build all that money, the U.S. money stimulates demand for products, and they come from other European countries, and that those gears kick in to going, and the whole contraption starts flapping across. But of course, it's not just these countries that make up the post-war global economic order. It has to extend elsewhere. For example, the deal the Roosevelt administration makes with the House of Saud to ensure access to oil on American terms, which isn't so much about American consumption, because the U.S. is by far the world's largest oil exporter before and during the war, but its domestic demand for oil is going to explode. So the oil that used to be exported is domestically consumed, and that Saudi Arabian oil can then be used to fuel capitalism in Europe. But that's only possible because we create a alliance between the tribal rulers of the peninsula that gives them privileged power, recognizes them as sovereign in exchange for them being just a part of the U.S. Formal global alliance. There's actually a funny thing in here where they point out that at the time, coal and oil were in competition, and a lot of planners said that they preferred oil because so many coal mines were in communist countries, whereas proven oil reserves at this point are concentrated in places that like the U.S. or places the U.S. could diplomatically overall, like Saudi Arabia. And it's very important that this oil is secured because I said earlier, right? These economies are based on filling the gap, the hole in the heart created by capitalist exploitation, right? What are we doing? What are these people being put to work for? They're being put to work to build stuff for people to buy so they can feel better about their lives. And what is the thing, the one commodity that represents this entire commodity relationship? Does anyone know? The commodity of the Fordist era. I said it, I gave it away right there in the name. The car, correct. The automobile. The personal automobile represents, in commodity form, all of the freedoms that are denied the worker. The freedom over time and space that are denied when you are forced to spend time in a space determined by your boss. A vehicle allows you to traverse time and space at your own will, right? Because nobody wants to go at foot speed anywhere. Nobody ever has. It's too slow, especially in a mediated world where stimulation is easier to come by. You need speed to actually exert will. And so you can command will, control the environment. Be the god that you can't be during your working time with a car. And it's big and it's expensive and they look different, so your aesthetic preferences can be represented in them. There's a different style. And that style can reflect you as a point of at the level of identity. And then it can give you control over your environment, literally, over time and space. Because remember, what had restarted the global economy? War armaments, big machines. That's what we had built our industrial economy around producing: tanks, airplanes, engines. And that had to be put to domestic use. They had to be switched to domestic means quickly, because if you build militarily, you have to destroy it. That's the thing. That's the cycle of military expenditure. Hitler built tanks, and that means you have to use tanks. Now, of course, if you sell everybody a car, you get to the point where they run out of cars, everyone's had a car, then you have a collapse, unless more and more people are buying cars. Younger and younger people are buying cars. New workers are buying cars. Unless it can operate in the logic of endless expansion. And so the automobile becomes the pivot of this global capitalist trade network. The U.S. builds cars for American consumption more than anything, but also exports them. Europe, the European countries, the bigger ones, build cars for domestic consumption and also trade. even in, and while they're doing this in Europe with the cars and everything and trying to create this industrial capitalism around automobile construction, which, again, how much at this point, right? We know what cars have done to the world. We know what car-based culture has done to community, to identity, to sanity, to the biome. We know that it's going to be a big part of what dooms us. And that is fundamental to capitalism. Like, they're looking for a solution to a problem. How do we fuel this economy after this war? And because their assumptions are capitalism must be persisted, they create a short-term fix that in the long run creates even greater contradictions. Yeah, like, this is a good example. Somebody says, so Cuba did this, right? Cuba actually did the deal where you take over the economy from a central position of planning and you socially figure out what to do, right? Now, of course, their answer was partially determined by the fact that the U.S. embargo meant that they weren't going to get enough. They were not going to get enough materials to be able to build much. The U.S. made sure of that. So what did they do instead? What was something that could be manufactured without imports? And the answer is health expertise. You could democratize health so that larger and larger portion, a state-directed portion of your population has the sort of detailed, hyper-expert understanding of the human body that can only be bought by the extension of surplus on it. People can't be doing other stuff. They've got to be fucking training to be doctors. And you take that surplus and you train people to be doctors. And actually, they've actually been able to turn this into a way to get capital into the country by exporting doctors to underserved countries. And the money that they get is, some of it they get to keep, but a bunch of it goes back to the state, which for the most part, they are fine with, because they understand that they wouldn't have their fucking medical educations if the state had not given it to them. It gets called like slavery. Like the Brazilians, the Bolsonaro kicked out a bunch of Cuban doctors who were serving like the deep interior of the Amazon where no doctors were. By saying like, oh, they're making them slaves. They're stealing their income. It's like they're paying for their education the way that we're expected to just take out giant loans. So this idea of building up individual industrial economies wherever they can so that they can trade with each other is the superseding goal of U.S. policy at this time. So that even in Latin America, which had been the place that we had destroyed all popular politics that demanded like control of resources because U.S. capital needed cheap access to their agricultural surplus. That was the whole open door policy that was like the fixation of the State Department during the 30s. Keeping access to raw materials from Latin America at American dictated prices. That meant keeping the left in check. That meant propping up dictators when you weren't overthrowing the governments themselves. But even during this period, not for a long time, but during this period specifically, U.S. policy towards Latin America, which was getting U.S. private investment when Europe wasn't, was to encourage domestic production. The developmentalist philosophy, the Keynesianism basically of the developing world after World War II, was called import substitution industrialization, because the non-communist answer to the challenge of how do you catch up to the West from the the position of colonial stagnation that Latin American countries were in, and African ones too, Asians as well, like the periphery, the global South. The reason that they were in this prostrate position and they couldn't accumulate capital is because they were dependent upon industrial imports. They had to import anything durable because all they had were their agricultural products, which were sold at cheap prices, which meant that nobody could buy enough to sustain domestic production. So the people who could buy had to buy in imports, which means your balance of trade is fucked. You can never develop domestic capacity. So that means that you needed a state project of substituting imports with domestic production. Instead of taking in X, we're going to build X, and that means the most popular imports there has to be an industrial policy of producing them domestically. And the U.S. during the 50s encouraged this. But of course, there is an inherent contradiction there that undoes the project that made it never really happen in Asia or Africa, and that is, at the end of the day, the U.S. needs those cheap resources more than it needs those countries to have stable, industrial capitalist economies. Because the center is always going to have its stability prioritized over the periphery. So it sacrifices ISI in the third world because it can no longer be afforded. Meanwhile, in the third world at this point, like Africa and Asia, the places that had been, till very recently, all been colonized by Europe, there were no developed state structures to build up. And so capital investment was minimal. And so you had a situation where the economy such as it existed was fixed into this cycle of money going out the door as you produce cheap agricultural products, cheap resources, where all the profits are concentrated by the very narrow political class and bureaucratic class, and like the large landowners, of course. And there's basically nothing left for a domestic consumer economy to buy. And that which can be bought has to be imported. And then that is the relationship between the real periphery and the center for the rest of till this moment. You never have that moment of industrial production because they never get the conditions that allow for it, which are high trade barriers. The U.S. built its industrial economy with tariffs. England did too. And as I said, even the post-war world still has, it does not have free trade. It has freer trade, but it does not have free trade. Meanwhile, by the time you do have like sufficient state structures to assert, a political project in the peripheral countries, by that point, the regime is actually no. It's totally free trade, and you get to negotiate. You get to negotiate from the same atomized position against concentrated capital that the individual worker does against an owner of a factory. Which is why China is important, because China is the only country in the colonized world that spent the 20th century building state capacity, building industrial capacity, and not having it imposed on them outside from the West. And yes, the reason for that is it's gigantic, and it's been a unified political unit, or it's been a coherent political entity for 2,000 years, which is not true of any of the other places, including India, by the way. India didn't come into being as its own thing, really, until the Raj. 5,000 years, yes, whatever. I don't buy any of that stuff, by the way. The idea that there's an extension of like Chinese state structure that extends like into the deep like iron Neolithic, don't buy it. Sorry. They're very precocious with state production, state development, but no. They started off the same place that everybody else did, and it was all trial and error. I think they did get it first, and they were able to sustain it longest, but then you're just trying to, all that is it's an attempt to, affirm the authority of the existing structure, which to me, I'm sorry, that doesn't affirm shit. I don't care how long fucking standing the thing is at the end of the day, because these things have to be transcended. I'm sorry. The rest of the colonized world is to the west as like a constellation of social if you define the West as like a constellation of cultural values, economic and political interlocking regimes of power and structure. There's no other state but China that can stand to that. Of course, Japan, which is basically China but like packed into a little archipelago, in that it's this hugely dense concentration of people and therefore capacities. They end up somewhere between Europe and the Third World after the war. Because their working class had been decapitated by fascism just as Germany's had, their post-war accommodation with labor is much more business-friendly. And the U.S. also, by the way, does gladio shit in Japan. The Yakuza, the Yakuza, as we understand it, organized crime in Japan, was stood up by the United States occupying forces. Like, they made formal and informal agreements with like networks of smugglers and like black marketeers who they gave state sanction to the activities of, because they would kill communists. And they ended up becoming like a fucking arm of the state. Like they're the most formally powerful of any of the organized crime structures that emerged after World War II. Like in Italy, they're a parallel state, but they're still all like formally illegal. But like Yakuzas sponsor like charity shit, like formally in Japan. They're quasi legal corporate entities, and that's because it happened. Those things emerged simultaneously. What we're having in countries like Mexico is where these structures are they exploded into existence really only in the past 30 years. And so that means that they have not been able to be assimilated into the structures of the state. They've just overtaken it almost overnight. And that is not a stable arrangement. That's why it's so horrifyingly violent there relative to the Yakuza. So Japan doesn't get a Marshall Plan, but what Japan gets instead is, during the Korean War, Japan is the main staging area for America's military forces, which means a huge infusion of U.S. money in the form of the spending power of American military forces who are there on leave or who are there in transit or in support roles, all of the construction that is necessitated by these guys. That economic activity is the infusion that stimulates domestic production in Japan. $6 billion is pumped into the Japanese economy by the U.S. military intervention in Korea, which at the time is gigantic and helps do the same the Keynesian pump priming that Marshall Plan money does in Europe and that private investment does in the Americas. Okay, so next week we will do. Next week. I think I might skip next week. I have a thing. I'll be out of town towards the end of the week. So when we come back, 2 weeks hence, I might do another stream like on Wednesday or something, but I will not be. It will not be the book because I want to give the whole week to read the 2 chapters because I know it's impossible to read, so I want to give anybody who does read the book a chance to catch up. So we'll skip a week and then we'll come back with part 3, the 2 chapters that make up part 3. Okay. Well, I hope everybody has a nice weekend. It's going to be beautiful here. Hope it's going to look nice where you are. Hope everybody keeps it sleazy. Peace and chicken grease.